To unpack what the reinstatement of sanctions means for Iran, we're now joined via Skype by Professor Seyed Marandi from the University of Tehran. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so perhaps you can help us explain, because there's a bit of confusion about which sanctions are there, which sanctions are to expire, and what is illegal about America's position in terms of trying to do this snapback?
Well, hypothetically, there should be no sanctions. All of the sanctions that we see right now are illegal. They are American sanctions that are imposed on the international community. Like, the Americans are like the Godfather. If they'll give you an offer that you can't refuse. So if you deal with the Iranians, then you're in trouble. That's how the Americans behave, and that's where the sanctions come from. So, for example, your own government in South Africa, they no longer purchase oil from Iran because they're afraid of the consequences from the United States. Whether it's private companies or the government, doesn't make a difference. Oil, which used to be purchased by South Africa, is no longer purchased. And of course, when the oil is purchased, then goods are also sold to Iran in return. So the United States is basically hurting the government of South Africa, the private sector of South Africa, for its own political purposes. And that's what it does to all the different countries. So according to the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, all of the U.S. sanctions and the UN sanctions, which the UN sanctions are not really that important, but basically the U.S. sanctions were supposed to come to an end. And the United States was no longer supposed to impede other countries from doing business with Iran. So Trump tore the agreement and went back to unilaterally imposing sanctions. And everything is sanctioned. There's nothing that is, let's say, free from sanctions. The United States has sanctioned everything in Iran. So you cannot trade with Iran, hypothetically, of course, according to U.S. sanctions. You cannot do business with Iran. And of course, Iran still does trade and does business, and because the United States is not as powerful as it would like to think.
So do the other superpowers that are at odds with America, particularly around this snapback, because they're saying, look, you pulled out of this agreement, but you can't now use the same agreement to reinforce sanctions on Iran?
Yes, and by the way, the only, as I said, according to the agreement, the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions were lifted, as well as the UN sanctions. And of course, as I said earlier, the UN sanctions really weren't that important. But in October, the UN sanctions on weapons exports and imports was supposed to end. And this is where the problem began. The Americans, since they wanted to prevent this from happening, they have begun bullying the Russians, the Chinese, and the Europeans, as well as other countries, into ending the nuclear deal by extending the embargo on the business of arms with Iran. And these countries have resisted because they know that if they extend the embargo, that would be not just a violation of the nuclear deal, that would be bringing a change to the nuclear deal. And the Iranians have said before that if the nuclear deal is changed, then we're out of it, then it's dead. That's why the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese have been resisting the United States, because they don't want the nuclear deal to die. The Americans want the nuclear deal to die. The rest of the international community doesn't want the deal to die. So the argument right now is the hypothetical lifting of the embargo, which was to end in October. Other sanctions were lifted immediately after the nuclear deal. The military sanctions were to be lifted this October, which the Americans wanted to stop. And this has become a major point of contention because the Americans, as you alluded to, they have left the deal. And according to the deal, the only countries that can take this issue to the UN Security Council, the only countries that can use this snapback mechanism have to be a part of the deal. If the Americans had remained within the nuclear deal, they could have used this mechanism. But what they foolishly did was that a couple of years ago, more than 2 years ago, they left the deal without using the mechanism. Now that they want to use the mechanism, they can't because they're outside of the deal. The Americans are saying, no, we're inside the deal, but no one accepts that. So it's sort of like a drunk person who's locked himself out of the house and he's cursing the rain. It's his own fault.
All right, so help us understand the value of this deal if the Americans are outside of it and they're strong-arming the international community with their own sanctions outside of the deal.
Well, that's a very good point, actually. The Americans are imposing very harsh sanctions on Iran. The objective of those sanctions are to kill as many Iranians as possible, to cause as much human suffering as possible. The Americans impede Iran from importing medicine. Of course, Iran produces most of its medicine, but the medicines that it needs or the materials that it needs to produce medicine at home, the U.S. tries to prevent Iran from importing foodstuff, grain, corn, and other things, and of course prevent Iran from exporting. So the Americans are effectively trying to strangle the Iranian economy, to make Iranians suffer to the maximum, which is a crime against humanity. And it's not just Iran. The Americans have helped destroy Syria with, through their support of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups, along with the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris and the Israelis. And then now they've imposed sanctions to destroy what's left of Syria. They're doing the same in Venezuela, in Cuba. It is a tool, it is a weapon that the Americans use. It doesn't look as ugly as bombing a country, but believe me, it's just as ugly. But Iran is a powerful country, so it's very difficult for the Americans to impose its will upon the Iranian people to the extent that it wants. So while the nuclear deal is not working for Iran because of the unilateral illegal American sanctions, but what Iran is trying to do through the preservation of the nuclear deal, is that it's trying to isolate the United States. It's showing the international community that the problem has never been Iran, contrary to what the Western media says. And now they're proving this point by saying that, look, we're abiding by the deal, the Americans aren't, and look how they're bullying the whole of the international community. So the Iranians are isolating the United States and thus weakening the U.S. status among major powers in the international community. So at the moment, this is a political battle, and it seems that the Iranians have done well. So while Iran is not benefiting from the nuclear deal because of the unilateral American sanctions, but what it has succeeded in doing is turning even the Europeans against the United States and isolating the United States, which doesn't bring bread to the table, but in the long run, the Iranians calculate that weakening the American position has advantages for Iran. Definitely.
Has Iran kept its end of the deal in terms of the agreement, stopping any progress on weaponizing their nuclear capability and allowing inspections from the International Atomic Agency, for example?
Well, actually, one of the myths that the Americans created in the first place was the accusation that Iran was pursuing nuclear weapons. And even though after the Iranians agreed to the nuclear deal, and in the agreement, the Iranians allowed the International Atomic Energy Agency extensive oversight. So the amount of, let's say, oversight and the ability to observe the Iranian nuclear program by the International Atomic Energy Agency is unprecedented in the world. They have more access to Iranian sites than anywhere else in the world. but they haven't shown any evidence that Iran at any point in the past was pursuing a nuclear weapon. So that is one myth that was busted. And then after the nuclear deal, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and it's on their website, the Iranians they were abiding by all of their commitments, whereas the Americans were not. Even under Obama, the Americans were intentionally violating their commitments. And then under Trump, the Americans tore the deal in violation and violated all of their commitments. Even after the Americans tore the deal and began to impose sanctions against Iran and all countries that want to work with Iran, the Iranians continued to abide by the deal in full, even though they were under sanctions, for a year and a half. And then when the Iranians saw that the Europeans were dragging their feet and they weren't finding a solution to the US sanctions, the Iranians in 5 stages decreased their commitments. But even now, the Iranians still give the International Atomic Energy Agency extensive capabilities to observe Iran's nuclear program in accordance with the deal. So Iran is still abiding by part of its commitments to the deal, whereas the Europeans and the Americans are not abiding by any of their commitments.
So why is America so hell-bent in creating this discomfort for Iran? Is it more to do with the politics of the region? I'm looking at the Gulf and recent diplomatic normalization between UAE and Israel, for example. Is that really what's going on in terms of the US and Iran?
The real problem is, I think, 2 issues. One is that the United States never forgave Iran from becoming independent after the revolution. That was unforgivable. And second was Iran's support for liberation movements, one of which was in South Africa. Iran supported the resistance to apartheid in South Africa, and Iran also supported the resistance to apartheid in Palestine and continues to do so. U.S. policy in our region is focused on Israel. And Israel has nuclear weapons. We know that Israel even helped apartheid South Africa acquire nuclear weapons because they were sister regimes. So the United States, their policy in Syria to destroy the country through terrorism, through extremism, is linked to its wish to keep Israel as a supreme power in the region. U.S. policy towards Iran, U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia, everything is more or less linked to Israel. So the United States wants a weak Iran because Iran does not want any country in this region to be strong and independent. Of course, I would argue that the United States doesn't want any country to be very strong, and one reason why the United States has suddenly grown so hostile towards China is because they fear that China will become a rival that surpasses it. So for Iran, the situation is quite clear. The United States calls the Iranians the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, but it is the United States that invaded Iraq. It is the United States that actually supported Saddam Hussein once upon a time and gave him chemical weapons to use against Iranians and his own people, and then later turned against them.